The Great Reset is here. Everything you need to know before it's too late. What I'm about to share with you this morning, January 28th, 2026, is something that will fundamentally change how you understand the world you're living in. This isn't speculation. This isn't theory. This is happening right now, and the internal memos I've seen over the past 72 hours confirm what many of us have suspected for years but couldn't prove. 24 hours ago, I received confirmation from sources embedded within the highest levels of global finance that the system you've been taught to trust, the system that manages your retirement, your savings, your future, is undergoing a complete restructuring. Not a reform, not an adjustment, a complete overhaul of everything you thought you knew about how money, power, and nations interact. And the terrifying part is that most people won't understand what's happening until it's far too late to prepare. What I'm about to reveal to you over the next several minutes isn't comfortable. It isn't convenient. And it certainly isn't what you'll hear on mainstream financial channels, but it is the truth. And the truth, as uncomfortable as it may be, is the only thing that can protect you and your family in the months and years ahead. Let me start with something that was said openly, publicly, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. These aren't hidden recordings. These aren't leaked documents. These are statements made on camera in front of the world by the very people who control the levers of global power. And yet, somehow, nobody is talking about it. The mainstream media glossed over it. The financial press buried it under headlines about stock movements and earnings reports. But what was said at that gathering represents nothing less than an admission that the world as we've known it for the past 80 years is over. A senior figure at Davos stated publicly that globalization has failed the West and the United States of America. Let that sink in for a moment. The people who built this system, who benefited from this system, who defended this system for decades against all criticism, are now openly admitting that it has failed. But here's where it gets wild. They're not admitting failure because they suddenly grew a conscience. They're admitting failure because they're preparing the ground for what comes next. And what comes next is something you need to understand before it arrives at your doorstep. Stay with me here, because this gets complex, but I promise to make it as clear as possible. After World War II, the major powers of the world came together and essentially divided up the global economy like a pizza. Each slice was assigned to a different player, and each player had a specific role to maintain the whole system. Understanding these roles is absolutely critical to understanding why everything is now falling apart and what the new arrangement will look like. China became the factory of the world. Their job was to manufacture goods cheaply and efficiently, providing the products that consumers in wealthy nations would buy. In exchange, they got access to markets, technology transfers, and the capital to build their economy. Japan became the lender of the system. By keeping interest rates at essentially zero for decades, they kept liquidity flowing through the global financial system. They became the quiet banker behind the scenes, ensuring that money was always available for those who needed it. Europe became the buyer and consumer of the world. They traded productivity and military independence for stability and social welfare programs. They outsourced their security to the United States and focused on building comfortable societies with robust social safety nets. And the United States, America, became the enforcer of the entire arrangement. Through the petrodollar system, where global oil transactions were conducted in US dollars and backed by the most powerful military-industrial complex the world has ever seen, America ensured that everyone played by the rules. This is what some analysts have called the proof of weapons network. It sounds aggressive because it is aggressive. The basic premise is simple. If you want to participate in global trade, if you want access to international markets, if you want investment in your economy, you have to agree to certain rules. Those rules were straightforward. Use dollars to buy energy. Do not threaten American interests. Do not challenge the system. Follow these rules, and you get access to the most liquid, most developed financial markets in the world. You get military protection. You get a seat at the table of global commerce. Break these rules, and the consequences are severe. Sanctions, economic isolation, and in extreme cases, military intervention. For decades, this system worked, or at least it appeared to work. If you were an American on the winning side of what economists call the K-shaped economy, you did incredibly well. The wealthy got wealthier. Investors saw their portfolios grow. The stock market reached heights that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Companies expanded globally, accessing cheap labor and new markets, returning massive profits to shareholders. Retirement accounts swelled. The American dream, for those at the top of the economic ladder, seemed more achievable than ever. But here's the part that nobody wanted to talk about. Let me show you the other side of this equation. To keep the system running, to maintain American hegemony, to enforce the rules of global trade, something had to be sacrificed. And what was sacrificed was the American working class. The jobs left. The factories closed. The supply chains relocated to cheaper labor markets overseas. Towns that once thrived on manufacturing became hollowed-out shells of their former selves. The opioid crisis, the despair, the anger, These weren't random developments. They were the predictable, inevitable consequences of a system designed to benefit capital at the expense of labor. The middle class wasn't accidentally left behind. It was systematically dismantled because doing so was profitable for those at the top of the pyramid. America stopped making things. The only products America consistently produced were money and technology. Financial engineering and software became the primary exports, while physical goods came from overseas. And this created a profound vulnerability that is now being exposed. But here's where it gets really interesting, and I need you to pay close attention to this next part because it explains everything that's happening in the headlines right now. The system required something to sustain itself. It required perpetual conflict, not necessarily hot war, though plenty of that occurred, but a state of constant tension, constant threat, constant justification for military spending and intervention. The forever war wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The military-industrial complex needed threats to justify its budget. The financial system needed instability in certain regions to maintain the dominance of the dollar. The political establishment needed enemies to distract the population from the erosion of their economic position. This worked for a long time. But systems based on exploitation and imbalance eventually reach a breaking point, and that breaking point has arrived. What changed? What caused this 80-year-old arrangement to finally crack? The answer is simple but profound. The nations that were supposed to remain subordinate in this system decided they no longer wanted to play by the rules. They looked at the game, realized it was rigged against them, and decided to create their own game instead. Stay with me here because this is crucial. Over the past 2 decades, a coalition of nations led by Russia, China, and their allies in what's sometimes called the BRICS bloc has been quietly building an alternative system. They've been creating their own payment networks, their own trade arrangements, their own financial infrastructure that doesn't depend on the dollar or access to Western markets. And they've become so powerful at this point that the old enforcement mechanisms no longer work. The proof of weapons network, the threat of military intervention or economic sanctions, only works if the threatened party has no alternatives. But now, they do have alternatives. And using the old tools of enforcement would require escalation to a level that nobody wants. We're talking about potential conflict between nuclear-armed powers. That's the line that cannot be crossed without risking everything. So what happens when the enforcer can no longer enforce? What happens when the rules can no longer be imposed? The answer is what we're witnessing right now, a complete restructuring of global power. And the people who have controlled this system for decades are scrambling to figure out their place in the new order. Let me take you inside what was really discussed at the World Economic Forum, because the public statements only tell part of the story. The real question on the table, the question that every panel and every private meeting was dancing around, was this: how do we divide power in the new world order? Notice the framing. Not whether there will be a new world order. That's already been decided. The question is how power will be distributed within it. To understand the answer, you need to understand who the players are. And this is where things get complicated, because there isn't just one power structure. There are multiple competing factions, each with their own interests, their own goals, and their own strategies for positioning themselves in whatever comes next. But here's where it gets wild. These factions aren't neatly aligned with nations or governments. The traditional understanding of geopolitics, where countries compete for power and influence, is outdated. The real power structures transcend national boundaries. They operate above and beyond the control of any single government, and understanding them is essential to understanding what's really happening. The first and most powerful faction is what we can call the financial globalists, sometimes referred to as transnational capital. Why that name? Because these entities don't pledge allegiance to any flag. They don't represent the interests of any particular nation. They are pure capital, pure money, and money can flow anywhere. Their loyalty is to returns, to growth, to the expansion of their own power and influence. At the apex of this structure sit the giant asset managers. 3 names dominate this space: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Together, these 3 entities manage tens of trillions of dollars in assets. To put that in perspective, their combined assets under management exceed the GDP of most nations on Earth. They are more powerful than all but a handful of governments, and in many ways they are more powerful than any government. How do they exercise this power? Let me show you, because this is something that most people don't understand. These asset managers control capital flows. Corporations need capital to grow, to invest, to survive. And the asset managers control access to that capital. If you're a CEO of a major corporation and you want your company to succeed, you need the blessing of these entities. You need them to include your stock in their indices, to recommend your shares to their clients, to vote in favor of your management at shareholder meetings. And here's the mechanism that gives them real power. When you invest your retirement savings in a mutual fund or an ETF managed by one of these firms, you're giving them your voting rights. You don't vote on corporate matters, they vote on your behalf. And the data shows that most investors never exercise their voting rights independently. According to BlackRock's own disclosures, out of trillions of dollars in index equity, only a small fraction of clients actually vote. The rest have their votes exercised by the asset managers themselves. This means that a handful of executives at these firms effectively control the direction of thousands of corporations worldwide. They decide who sits on boards, they decide corporate policy, they decide which companies thrive and which companies struggle. Without passing a single law, without firing a single shot, they shape the economy through their control of capital allocation. This is the first thing you need to understand. The most powerful entities in the global economy aren't governments. They aren't elected officials. They're the custodians of capital who determine where money flows and under what conditions. But the asset managers aren't the only players in this financial power structure. Stay with me here because this gets complicated. The banking system, particularly the central banks, represents another center of power within the financial industrial complex. And their interests don't always align with the asset managers. Consider what one of the central bankers said at Davos. In an unscripted moment, Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank made a remarkable statement. She said she wasn't going to tell anyone that central banks would always be around. Think about what that means. The head of one of the most powerful central banks in the world is acknowledging that the institution she leads might become obsolete. This isn't idle speculation. This is a senior official preparing the ground for a fundamental change in how monetary systems operate. The banks, led by figures like Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, want to preserve the existing system as much as possible. Dimon has openly called himself a globalist. He wants NATO to remain strong. He wants Western institutions to maintain their primacy. He wants the rules that have benefited the banking sector to remain in place. But he's swimming against a current that grows stronger every day. The conflict between these financial factions plays out in the debate over central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. This is not some abstract policy discussion. This is a battle for the future of money itself. Let me explain why this matters so much. The banks fear disintermediation. That's a technical term, but it means something simple. They fear being cut out of the flow of capital. Right now, when money moves through the economy, it moves through banks. They take their cut, they maintain their relevance, they exercise their power. But what if money could move without them? What if transactions could occur on blockchain rails that bypass the traditional banking system entirely? This is the threat posed by cryptocurrency. And it's the threat that the asset managers are exploiting through their push for tokenization. Larry Fink has been talking about this for years. The idea is to put all assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, commodities, everything onto blockchain systems where they can be traded instantly, globally, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And to fractionalize these assets, breaking them into tiny pieces that anyone can own. On the surface, this sounds democratic. It sounds like it's opening up investment opportunities to regular people. But think about who controls the infrastructure. The asset managers already control the assets. Tokenization would give them control of the rails as well. They would see every transaction in real time. They would have unprecedented visibility into capital flows. They would have tools for surveillance and control that previous generations of financial oligarchs couldn't have dreamed of. The banks are fighting back with their own version of digital currency. CBDCs would give central banks their own programmable money, their own way of staying relevant in a world where cash is disappearing and private payment systems are taking over. But they're also terrified of what happens if corporations are allowed to issue their own digital currencies that pay interest. Imagine if Tesla or Apple could issue their own coins that paid you 5% annual interest on your savings. Why would you keep your money in a bank account paying a fraction of a percent when you could earn 20 times more with a corporate coin? This is an existential threat to banking as we know it. And the battle over who gets to control digital currency is one of the defining conflicts of this moment. But here's where it gets really interesting. The crypto lobby sees an opportunity in all of this. Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, has been explicit about what he wants: fair competition. Because in a fair game, crypto wins. The technology is superior. The returns are better. The control is distributed rather than centralized. The only thing keeping traditional banks in the game is regulatory capture, the fact that they've written the rules to benefit themselves and handicap their competitors. This is the first major power block you need to understand. The financial industrial complex comprising asset managers, banks, and the crypto challengers, all competing for control of capital flows in the new economy. They may fight among themselves, but they share a common interest in maintaining their position at the top of the economic pyramid. The second major power block is what I call the sovereigns. These are the leaders of nations who have decided that globalization is a threat to their power and control. They're not trying to win the globalization game. They're trying to opt out of it entirely. Who are the sovereigns? Think of Vladimir Putin. Russia has enormous natural resources, particularly oil and gas. Under the globalist model, those resources would be developed by multinational corporations. Western oil companies would extract the wealth. Profits would flow to shareholders in New York and London. The Russian state would get a cut, but the real value would be captured elsewhere. Putin rejected this model. He renationalized strategic industries. He maintained state control over energy resources. He accepted that Russia's stock market might underperform Western markets because he prioritized sovereignty over returns. And for this, he became an enemy of the financial industrial complex. The same logic applies to China under Xi Jinping. China participated in globalization on its own terms. They used it to build their industrial base, to acquire technology, to lift hundreds of millions out of poverty. But they never surrendered state control of strategic sectors. They never allowed transnational capital to dictate their domestic policies. And as they grew more powerful, they became less willing to accept Western rules. The sovereigns understand something crucial. If you allow transnational capital into your country without restrictions, you're not gaining access to investment. You're surrendering control. The investors will demand changes to your laws, your regulations, your policies. They'll push for privatization. They'll push for deregulation. They'll push for whatever maximizes their returns, regardless of what it does to your society. This is why the financial industrial complex hates the sovereigns so much. They're unpredictable. They're inefficient from a capital allocation perspective. They resist the logic of pure profit maximization. But they're popular with their populations because they deliver something that pure capitalism cannot: stability, order, and the sense that someone is in control and looking out for ordinary people. Let me show you how this plays out in practice. Look at how the United States has responded to nations that try to exit the globalist system. Sanctions, asset freezes, exclusion from the SWIFT banking system. These are economic weapons designed to punish disobedience. But they only work if the targeted country has no alternatives, and increasingly, they do have alternatives. The third power block is the technologists, sometimes called the technocrats. These are the builders of the digital infrastructure that increasingly mediates all human activity. They don't care much about nationalism versus globalism. They care about efficiency, scale, and networks. They believe that technology will eventually replace or automate most of what governments and institutions currently do. The technologists are in an interesting position. They're not at the top of the power structure. They don't control capital flows directly, but they're essential to everyone else's plans. The financial powers need them to build the tokenization infrastructure, the digital payment systems, the AI that will manage tomorrow's economy. The sovereigns need them to build surveillance systems, digital ID programs, social credit scores, automated governance tools. As globalization breaks down, the technologists actually become more powerful. Why? Because the solutions to fragmentation are technological. If you can't maintain a unified global economy through political agreements, maybe you can maintain it through technological platforms that transcend borders. If you can't trust other nations, maybe you can trust algorithms that enforce agreements automatically. This is why so much investment is flowing into artificial intelligence, into blockchain systems, into automated governance tools. The technologists are positioning themselves to be essential to whatever comes next, regardless of which political faction ends up on top. The fourth power block is the military-industrial complex. This is the enforcement layer of the global system. Their power comes from weapons and intelligence, from the capacity for violence that underpins all other forms of power. But here's something crucial to understand. The military isn't subordinate to governments in the way that civics textbooks suggest. The military-industrial complex is subordinate to the financial-industrial complex because financial powers dominate governments, not the other way around. Defense contractors thrive on instability. The more threats in the world, the more justification for military spending, the more profits for the companies that build weapons and provide military services. This creates a perverse incentive toward perpetual conflict. Not necessarily hot war, but constant tension, constant threat, constant readiness for war that never quite arrives. But here's the good news, and I want to be clear about this. The current realignment actually reduces the risk of major war. The old system required the forever war model to sustain itself. The new system, whatever it turns out to be, is being negotiated rather than fought. The various power blocks are working out their positions through economic competition, through positioning, through theater, rather than through actual combat. This brings me to something I've believed for a long time, and I think the events of recent months have confirmed it. What we're seeing in the headlines, the tensions with various nations, the dramatic statements from political leaders, the apparent conflicts and crises, most of it is theater. It's geopolitical posturing designed to establish negotiating positions in the new order. Stay with me here, because this is important. I believe that the broad outlines of the New World Order have already been negotiated. Not the exact details, not every specific arrangement, but the general framework. The powerful players have already agreed on the basic shape of what comes next. What we're watching now is the public performance that justifies and legitimizes those arrangements to their respective populations. Think about it. The people who control trillions of dollars in assets, who run the world's largest banks, who command the world's most powerful militaries. Do you really think they're making decisions on the fly? Do you think they're reacting to events rather than shaping them? These are the most powerful people on Earth. They don't leave things to chance. They plan. They coordinate. They negotiate behind closed doors and then present the outcomes as if they were the result of public processes. This doesn't mean there's some single conspiracy controlling everything. There are multiple competing factions, as I've described. They don't agree on everything. They're genuinely competing for power and position. But they're competing within a framework that they've mutually agreed upon. The range of possible outcomes has been pre-negotiated. The theater is about positioning within that range, about appearing strong or appearing reasonable, about justifying to domestic audiences whatever bargains have been struck. Why am I telling you all this? Because understanding the game is the first step toward protecting yourself and your family from its consequences. The transition from one world order to another is never smooth. There are always disruptions, always casualties, always people who get caught in the gears of history because they didn't see what was coming. Let me be very specific about what this means for you. But first, let me anticipate an objection. Some of you are probably thinking that this sounds like conspiracy theory territory. You've been trained to dismiss this kind of analysis as paranoid, as fringe, as not serious. And I understand that impulse. It's a defense mechanism. The implications of what I'm describing are so vast, so unsettling, that it's more comfortable to dismiss them than to engage with them. But consider this. Everything I've described is based on publicly available information. The statements from the World Economic Forum are on video. The data about asset manager voting power comes from their own disclosures. The mechanics of the global financial system are described in academic papers and central bank reports. I'm not making claims about secret meetings or hidden agendas. I'm simply connecting dots that are visible to anyone who takes the time to look. The reason this sounds conspiratorial is that we've been conditioned to think about power in simplistic terms. We're taught that power resides in elected governments, that decisions are made through democratic processes, that the system is more or less transparent and accountable. This is a comforting fiction. The reality is that power is concentrated in ways that most people never think about, and those who hold it are very good at keeping attention focused elsewhere. So what should you do with this information? How do you prepare for the transition to a new world order? First, understand that the rules are changing. The strategies that worked in the old system may not work in the new one. If you've been investing based on assumptions about continued globalization, about the perpetual dominance of the dollar, about the stability of current institutions, you need to reassess. The world is fragmenting into regional blocks. Supply chains are reorganizing. The financial infrastructure is being rebuilt. Your investments should reflect this reality. Second, reduce your dependence on systems that may become unreliable. This applies to everything from your savings to your physical security. The transition period will involve disruptions, banks may face crises, currencies may fluctuate wildly, supply chains may break down temporarily. Having some resilience, some capacity to weather disruptions is prudent. Third, pay attention to what's actually happening rather than what you're told is happening. The mainstream narrative is designed to keep you passive, to keep you consuming, to keep you focused on distractions while the real changes occur beneath the surface. Develop independent sources of information. Learn to read between the lines. Understand that the dramatic conflicts in the headlines often obscure more important developments that get less attention. Fourth, build community. In times of transition, isolated individuals are vulnerable. Those who have strong relationships, who are embedded in networks of mutual support, are more resilient. This is true at every level, from your immediate family to your local community to your broader social connections. Let me tell you something that the powerful understand but rarely say openly. The greatest threat to concentrated power is organized people. This is why so much effort goes into keeping the population atomized, distracted, and divided against itself. They want you focused on culture war issues, on tribal identities, on anything that prevents you from recognizing your common interests with others who are in the same position. The New World Order will benefit some and harm others. The Technologists will do well. Those with capital and connections will find opportunities in the transition. But ordinary people, those who depend on wages, who have their savings in conventional instruments, who rely on institutional stability for their security, they are the ones at risk. I want to be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that you should panic. I'm not saying that collapse is imminent. I'm not saying that you should sell everything and move to a bunker. What I'm saying is that awareness and preparation are prudent. The people at the top are preparing. They're positioning themselves for what comes next. You should be doing the same. Now, let me give you some specific deadlines to pay attention to. Now, these are not arbitrary dates. They're moments when decisions will be made, when transitions will occur, when the shape of the new order will become clearer. Watch what happens in the currency markets over the next quarter. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency is being challenged. The pace of de-dollarization is accelerating. Central banks around the world are diversifying their reserves, buying gold, establishing alternative payment systems. The dollar won't collapse overnight, but its gradual decline will have profound implications for everyone holding dollar-denominated assets. Watch what happens with CBDC rollouts over the next 12 months. Multiple major economies are preparing to launch or expand central bank digital currencies. The infrastructure of digital money is being built right now. How it's designed, who controls it, what freedoms it allows, and what restrictions it imposes, these decisions are being made now and will be very difficult to change once the systems are in place. Watch what happens with the regulatory battles over cryptocurrency. The next 6 months will be decisive. Either the crypto lobby will succeed in creating space for fair competition, or the banking lobby will succeed in strangling the competition through regulation. The outcome will determine whether there's any alternative to the controlled digital money systems that governments and banks want to impose. Watch what happens in the corporate governance space. The asset managers are facing pushback over their voting practices, their ESG initiatives, their influence over corporate policy. If that pushback succeeds, it could shift power away from the concentrated financial centers. If it fails, the consolidation of power will continue. These are not distant events. They're happening now, in 2026, and the next few months are critical. By the time most people realize what's happening, the positions will be locked in and the opportunities for influence will have passed. Let me also be honest about something. I don't have all the answers. Nobody does. The situation is complex, the players are numerous, and the outcomes are uncertain. What I've given you is a framework for understanding, a map of the terrain. But maps are not the territory. You'll need to navigate the actual landscape as it unfolds, making decisions based on incomplete information like everyone else. What I can tell you is this. The people who succeed in transitions like this are those who see what's happening early, who prepare while others are still asleep, who maintain flexibility and adaptability while others cling to outdated assumptions. Information is power. Understanding the game gives you a chance to play it rather than being played. I also want to acknowledge something else. This transition is not all bad. The old system was exploitative and unstable. It enriched a few while impoverishing many. It required perpetual war. It destroyed communities and degraded environments. Its ending creates pain and disruption, but also opportunity. The new order, whatever it turns out to be, could be better, or it could be worse. That depends in part on how informed and engaged people are as it takes shape. The financial industrial complex wants a new order where they maintain control through technological means, where money is programmable and surveilled, where capital flows are even more concentrated and efficient. The sovereigns want a new order where they maintain control through political means, where borders and identities remain meaningful, where technology serves state power rather than replacing it. The technologists want a new order where efficiency and optimization override both financial and political constraints, where algorithms make decisions that humans currently make. None of these visions has ordinary people's interests at heart. But ordinary people are not powerless. We are many and they are few. The systems they build require our participation to function. Our leverage comes from our ability to withdraw that participation, to build alternatives, to organize and coordinate in ways that challenge concentrated power. This is why they work so hard to keep us distracted, divided, and demoralized. A population that understood what was happening and organized accordingly would be a genuine threat to their plans. The bread and circuses of modern media, the manufactured controversies, the constant state of crisis and outrage, these are not accidents. They're tools for managing the population during a transition. I've been watching these developments for years, and I've never been more concerned about what's coming than I am right now. But concern is not despair. Awareness is not helplessness. The same information that reveals the challenges also reveals the opportunities. The same understanding that shows how much is changing also shows how much is still possible. What should you do right now, today, this week? Let me give you a progression of actions from simple to more involved. At the minimum, start paying attention. Follow the sources that actually explain what's happening rather than just reacting to events. Develop a framework for understanding the power dynamics I've described. This alone will give you an advantage over most people. Next, assess your own position. Where are you vulnerable to the disruptions I've described? Are your savings in instruments that assume the old system will continue? Do you depend on supply chains that may become unreliable? Do you have the resilience to weather temporary disruptions? Then begin taking steps to reduce those vulnerabilities. This might mean diversifying your assets. It might mean reducing debt. It might mean developing skills or relationships that increase your independence and resilience. It might mean having conversations with family members about what's happening and how to prepare. For those who want to do more, consider how you can contribute to building alternatives. Are there local initiatives you can support? Are there organizations working on these issues that could use your involvement? Are there ways you can help your community become more resilient and less dependent on fragile systems? And for those who are in positions of influence, however small, consider how you can use that influence to raise awareness and shape outcomes. The battle for the new order isn't just happening in Davos boardrooms. It's happening in every community, every institution, every network where decisions get made. The more informed people there are at every level, the better the outcome is likely to be. I want to close with something that might seem unexpected given everything I've said. Despite all of this, despite the power dynamics and the machinations and the transitions, I remain fundamentally optimistic about humanity's potential. Not because I think the people in charge have good intentions, not because I think the systems are fair, but because I've seen what ordinary people can accomplish when they understand what's happening and decide to act. Every great transformation in human history has involved moments like this, moments when the old order is breaking down and the new one hasn't yet solidified, moments of danger but also of possibility, moments when the actions of individuals and communities can have outsized effects because the systems are fluid and the outcomes are not yet determined. We are living in such a moment. The end of globalization as we've known it, the restructuring of global power, the transition to new technological and financial systems. This is not just a crisis, it's an opportunity to shape what comes next, an opportunity to build something better, an opportunity that our children and grandchildren will either thank us for seizing or curse us for squandering. The choice is yours. You can go back to your regular programming, pretend you didn't hear any of this, and hope that everything works out. Or you can take what I've shared seriously, do your own research, and start preparing for what's coming. The information is out there for anyone willing to look for it. The dots are there for anyone willing to connect them. The opportunities are there for anyone ready to seize them. Today is January 28th, 2026. The transitions I've described are accelerating. The window for preparation is narrowing. What you do in the next few weeks and months may determine how well you and your family navigate what's ahead. I don't know exactly how this will unfold. Nobody does. But I know that awareness is better than ignorance, that preparation is better than surprise, and that community is better than isolation. These are the fundamentals that will serve you regardless of exactly how the details play out. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for being willing to engage with difficult information. And thank you for being part of the community of people who are paying attention, who are preparing, and who are working to shape a better outcome for all of us. The old world is dying. The new world is being born. What happens in between depends on all of us. Remember, the most powerful weapon against concentrated power is informed, organized people. They know this, which is why they work so hard to keep us uninformed and disorganized. Every person who wakes up, who starts paying attention, who begins to prepare and to help others do the same, is a small victory against the forces that would prefer we remain passive and compliant. You now have information that most people don't have. You understand dynamics that most people don't understand. What you do with this knowledge is up to you. But remember that with understanding comes responsibility. Those who see clearly have an obligation to help others see. Those who prepare have an obligation to help others prepare. We're all in this together, whether we recognize it or not. The era of pretending that politics happens over there while we live our lives over here is over. The era of trusting institutions to look out for our interests is over. The era of assuming that tomorrow will look basically like today is over. A new era is beginning, and we are the ones who will live through it, who will shape it, who will determine whether it represents a step forward or a step back for humanity. This is the most important moment to be alive in living memory. Not because it's the most comfortable, not because it's the most stable, but because it's the moment when the future is most plastic, most shapeable, most responsive to our choices and actions. Rise to the occasion. The stakes could not be higher, and the outcome has never been more dependent on what each of us chooses to do. Stay alert. Stay informed, stay connected, and above all, stay active. The future is not something that happens to us. It's something we create together. What happens next is up to us.